Well, welcome everyone to the third of this four-part series. For those of you that were here last time or who watched the videos of the last one, last time I talked quite a bit about scientific research on subtle energy and consciousness, which makes us challenge our assumptions about how the world is put together and how we relate to the world. And so I'd like to start with just a little bit more from science, and then we're going to talk about stages of awakening. So there was, or there is a scientist named Bekenstein, and he came up with a very simple proof. I think this was a one-page proof in Scientific American that you didn't have to be a physicist to understand. And basically what he proved is if you have an interface between any two things, so an example would be, let's say you come into a room and there's a computer monitor and you don't know who or what is on the other side, that he proved there's a finite amount of information that can go in either direction through that interface. And it's directly proportional to the size of the screen. So what that inspired me to think about is that, well, imagine if you go into the room and you've got your computer interface and God's on the other side, or whatever you think of God, the wisdom of the universe, that there still would be the limitations of existence about what can be known in existence of whatever's on the other side. But even more significantly, what could be known on the other side, what we think of as this omnipotent being, which is the usual notion of what the divine is about. Well, this is saying there would be a finite limit to even what the divine could know of everything in manifestation. So it's impossible to have everything go through in both directions. So what can we do to increase the capacity? Well, one would be to increase the size of the interface. So that doesn't mean going out and buying a 90-inch TV screen, although that would be kind of analogous to this. It means awakening our capacity to do what I started talking about last week, to discover the fact that we have our existence in multiple levels of reality simultaneously all of the time. And then you might go, well, how come I don't know about these other levels? Well, they're latent, they're dormant, and it's not a given. It's not on autopilot that we're going to have any knowledge of them. They have to be developed. So similarly to the way that we came into life as an infant, and we had to learn how to move our body around, we had to learn how to manipulate objects, we had to learn about objects remain constant even if they disappear from sight, and so on. So we had to develop a coherent frame of reference as a separate individual to have a sense of identity to be able to function in the world. But the progress with that sense of identity is not linear. It wasn't continuous. So some of you may be familiar with a Swiss psychologist named Piaget, and he came up with a theory of stages of development for children, and it's just fascinating. I learned about him when I was at Stanford. So I'll just briefly describe what these stages are. The first is the sensory motor stage, which is just learning how to move your body and interact with your environment. And this is the first 2 years of life. And then from about 2 to 5 or so, there's the what he calls pre-operational stage. And this is the stage of magical thinking, that you really don't understand how things work, but you think, well, if I just wish for something, it's going to magically happen. And you have a kind of a magical explanation for why things are the way they are. And then there's concrete operations, which is just developing kind of basic notions of logic and arithmetic and so on. And it isn't until adolescence that formal operations, which is associated with abstract reasoning, comes along. And so if you try to teach a young child something about abstract reasoning, they might parrot the answer, but it's impossible for them to comprehend what's going on. The brain had to develop in a certain way, so there had to be a maturation for this to take place. Similarly, in psychology, there are other theorists that talk about stages of development. Erickson has got stages, Kohlberg has stages of moral development. And Maslow, that some of you may be familiar with, talks about the hierarchy of needs, and the basic needs is just physical needs of survival and so on, all the way up to the highest level, which is self-actualization or transcendent kinds of experiences. But you can't get to that if you haven't taken care of the things on the other levels. So why do I mention all of these things? Well, there's a point that I've made in the previous talks that sometimes it's hard for us to grasp, because we're used to assuming that things develop just sequentially and linearly over the course of time, a little more of this and a little more of that and so on. But that's not the way that things happen. There are discontinuities, just like there's discontinuities in Piaget's stages, there's discontinuities in Kohlberg stages of moral development and so on. So just even our development as humans in our cognition is not linear and continuous. On the spiritual journey, there are also significant discontinuities. And one assumption that most people have on their spiritual journey is that they're starting at a certain point, a certain way of being in the world, and then they learn about, well, maybe there's more to reality than what I assumed, and maybe they read about beings such as the Buddha or learn about Christ and just the great beings that have been throughout history, and go, well, I'd like to be able to be more like this being. And so they begin their spiritual journey and pursue a spiritual path. But most of the time, the assumption is that they are operating from their individual personal consciousness, and then they're doing things that they think is somehow going to add things to that kind of basic level of function that's going to turn them into this different state of being. Well, if you read about people that have had transcendent experiences, they're anything but continuous with their ordinary way of looking at the world. I mean, they are so different that normally they're impossible to put into words, and at best, people can describe them by images or similes or metaphors or parables, but they say it's really a state in which things were so different, and they can't even bring back the fullness of the experience with their ordinary thinking mind. So here's another basic assumption that we don't think of as an assumption, because it seems so obvious to us that how we think about things is the way that things are. How we understand things must be the way that things are, or, well, we wouldn't want to understand them that way if it wasn't accurate. But when someone has an experience like this, it just shatters the previous assumptions and state of functioning. And then what often will happen is the person, if it was a really wonderful experience, will try to recreate the circumstances, whatever it was that they were doing, because they'd like to get back to that experience. And that just about never works. You can't get there by just gritting your teeth and trying to do certain things to achieve something that was a spontaneous experience, which perhaps was brought about by doing spiritual practices, which are very valuable. And a lot of times what many spiritual practices do is they focus the mind on something and enable the usual ordinary thinking mind to let go of its habits, so an experience can take place that's beyond the ordinary level of thinking. Okay. So I'd like to talk a little bit about chaos theory, which you probably all heard of. And you've probably seen these beautiful pictures of fractals that look like paisley patterns. And if you've ever seen a computer program where you can magnify a part of one of these fractal designs, it has a principle called self-similarity, that you could magnify it 1,000,000 times, and every time you magnify it, it's going to look similar to what you started with, but it's never exactly what you started with, and it goes on infinitely, smaller and larger. In a chaotic system, the end state can't be predicted from the initial conditions. So this is why you've probably heard the saying, well, a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, and then there's a hurricane somewhere else in the world. So the weather forecasters have gotten much better at forecasting the weather several days ahead, but sometimes it's just totally different from what was forecast, and you'll notice that a forecast is given in terms of probabilities, and all that means if they say there's a 50% chance of rain is 50% of the time when conditions were very similar to what they are now, it's going to rain. Doesn't mean it is going to rain or it's not going to rain. Well, even if they could calculate the initial conditions out to 10 decimal places, as things unfold, the tiny difference in the 10th decimal place can make a huge difference several days down the road, and it's impossible to get enough detail to have a totally accurate forecast. And many systems are like that. And what the system is going to organize to oftentimes could not be predicted from the starting conditions. And so you could have two very similar starting conditions, let's say with differences in the 10th decimal place, and you let the system run for a period of time. And after a while, what you end up with, the two things, two states, are you wouldn't think that they came from the same initial conditions. So spiritual awakening is something like that. And the mystics have terms to describe the process that an individual goes through along the way. And so I'll use the terms that I'm familiar with in the Sufi tradition. And I'll use Arabic words, but then I'll translate them. The one word is fana, F-A-N-A, and the traditional translation is annihilation, like the usual ego is just annihilated. Well, I'm not real wild about that one. I prefer to think of it as there's a shattering of a previous state of functioning or a previous vantage point. And from that is Baqa, B-A-Q-A, which means an organization to a higher state of being. And unlike the way that many people think about the spiritual journey, it isn't just a one done deal, like, okay, there's this period of breakdown, and then you are reorganized into this higher state, and then you're done. You've crossed the finish line. I was saying that I used to think that the aim was just to get to this final state, and that was it. You know, you're in bliss forever. You dissolve the sense of personal identity, and you've merged into the beyond. But then I started asking myself, well, you know, if that's what it's all about, what's the purpose of having existence? Why is there a manifestation if it's just all about going back to where we came from? And this is the notion in at least some traditions of spirituality. The description of reality is described as Maya, illusory, it's transitory, that the real with a capital R reality is something beyond existence. But at least the Sufi tradition that I have studied under for many years says that the purpose of existence is to awaken in life. It's to be able to experience, yes, the transcendent aspect of our being, and by this I mean the other levels of subtle reality on which we have our existence, but then to take that and bring it into our life in the world and manifest that which can only come through each of us in a unique way. So it's like furthering the purpose of existence as opposed to getting out of manifestation, which is a different way of thinking about spirituality. And so this implies a spirituality which I think of as an evolutionary spirituality. It implies, if we, an evolutionary notion of however we think about the divine being, instead of thinking of the divine as being something static and uninvolved in existence. At least some mystics and the Sufis talk about our beings as being beings of bi, B-I hyphen unity. And what that means is we are human hyphen divine beings, or human hyphen transcendent beings, and we have our existence in both of these levels of reality. And normally, our vantage point, our frame of reference, our identity is solely in physical manifestation. It's not in the other. And then when we have an experience in the transcendent realm, we perceive that as something anomalous and totally separated from the physical reality. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes that seems so much better than what's going on here in the physical world. We just try our best to get back to that transcendent state. And if we do that to the extreme, we can engage in what my teacher Pir Balayat called the spiritual bypass. And what that is just not wanting to deal with the messiness of the world and psychological issues and traumatic situations and so on, and wanting just to go inside and experience a state of bliss. But when someone undertakes that route, it usually results in them becoming less and less capable of functioning in the world, which isn't too useful if you feel like, well, I'd like to be able to do something to make this world a better place. And I talked some last time about oftentimes people that are really into service, which is a wonderful thing, but if they're just paying attention to that, their outer state of functioning, a lot of times they get really burned out because it's frustrating. It seems like the problems that they're trying to do something about are so enormous, and sometimes it seems like nothing is really changing, that it's very easy to get very discouraged. Well, if you were tuned in last time, I talked about William Tiller's research on subtle energy and how he showed that whenever you have a linkage between a subtle level of existence and ordinary reality, now new possibilities are opened up in that ordinary reality. It's been really transformed. There are things possible now that were not possible before. And I think that is very much true of when we do whatever it is that helps us to awaken to our deeper nature, to awaken spiritually, whether it's through meditation or prayer or just really deeply connecting with whatever it is that we're experiencing. It really is bringing about a transformation. And it's not just wishful thinking, oh, I'm putting out good vibes here. Something is happening to the energy around us, and something is happening to the people that we're interacting with, and they may not necessarily be aware of it, but we can become like a catalyst, something that may trigger something in the other person, not necessarily at that moment, maybe a long time in the future from then. So I think this is the way, this is where I got the idea of calling the series Spiritual Awakening as Service to the World. So I would say the traditional way of thinking about spirituality and spiritual awakening is it's an individual pursuit, and perhaps you're pursuing it with like-minded people on the same path, but you're really doing it for your own awakening to try to reach some end state of being. And instead of thinking of it like that, what happens if we think of it in terms of all of existence is seeking to awaken to a higher state of being, to self-organize to a higher state of possibilities. And when we consciously participate in this process, we're furthering the reason why there's an existence in the first place, not just of our own being, but why there's everything, the purpose of this. So let me read you a little bit about someone named Irvin Laszlo, who has twice been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. One of his books is called The Self-Actualizing Cosmos, The Akasha Revolution in Science and Human Consciousness. Excuse me. He presents recent scientific evidence for the cosmos being an integral system actualizing in the interaction of two dimensions, an unobservable deep dimension and an observable manifest dimension. Each of these two dimensions acts on and alters the other, and together they result in a universe that's always evolving. Non-locality is a basic feature of this new, for science, paradigm. And non-locality refers to interactions between parts of the whole that transcends the known effects of the usual causal effects propagating in space and time. So this is a very different way of thinking about what's going on in existence. And from this perspective, it isn't just what's in manifestation, including our notions of who we are as physical beings on Earth that's evolving, but the whole system is evolving, including the parts that are transcendent, including the subtle levels of reality. And I really believe, and there's evidence from this, from experiments that are being done and have been done, that when more and more people awaken to the higher potentialities of their being, changes can take place in the world that would not take place otherwise. It couldn't take place through no matter how many well-minded individuals are operating from a dualistic state of consciousness. So this is spirituality, the purpose of which is not to return to a perfect, pristine state beyond manifestation, but rather to actively participate in each of our contributions to what's known and what can be known. And here's another way of thinking about things that I think, at least for me, has gone by the wayside. I used to think of, some of you may have heard of this notion of the Akashic record. It's kind of like the cosmic library of everything that could be known. And another way of thinking about it would be like the mind of God, that God knows everything. He's omnipotent. He or she knows everything that has been, will be, ever could be. And so I thought of this as kind of this fixed thing that if we tapped into, we would just have access to this wonderful wisdom, but it's just kind of all sitting there outside of space and time. And now I really believe that if there is such a thing, and instead of calling it the Akashic record, you could call it the collective information that's been gleaned by everything in existence throughout all time and space. And by the way, many physicists now are postulating that what they call the quantum vacuum or the 0-point field might be a repository of all the information that there is. So they're coming at similar ideas with very different language. And I think I mentioned last time that Seth Lloyd, who is a computer scientist at MIT, has postulated that our entire universe is like a giant quantum computer. And then one asked, well, what is the computer computing? And he said, itself. It's like it's trying to know itself. And the mystics have said, excuse me a second, that God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known, to love and be loved. And so God brought forth existence. But it's the same idea with very different language. And it's a never-ending process. And what can possibly be known can never be fully known. In other words, all the possibilities can never fully be known because they are actualized, they are created along the way. And they can't, just like I was talking about chaos theory, they can't be predicted. It's not a Newtonian cosmic universe. So we can consciously participate in the evolution and unfoldment of what's possible to come through, the creative possibilities of the universe. Okay, so what are some basic tools that may help us with this? As you may be thinking, well, that sounds good, but how in the world do I get there from where I'm starting from? Well, one big thing that helps with that is to realize you can't get there continuously and linearly from where you're starting from. You have to, excuse me, be willing to experience states of consciousness in which you release your usual foothold in physical manifestation, which is based on the input of the senses, which is based on all the thoughts that go around in our head, which is based on our emotions, our reactions to circumstances, and the collective totality of all this is usually how we think of as ourselves. Well, who am I? Well, I'm this physical body, and I've got my mind, and I've got my heart, and I've got my personality, and I've got my history in this world, and so on. And a lot of times we think, well, that's all that there is to me. Or we may think, well, I'd like to get to where some of these great beings have gotten to, so I'm just going to try doing different things until I turn where I started from into something else. But like I said, it's not linear, it's not continuous, and you can't get there in a gradual manner from the way that you think that you can. A child who has gone through the stages of Piaget and has progressed to abstract reasoning, if they didn't know about Piaget, they probably would have a hard time understanding of how, if some experiments were done when they were younger, they wouldn't get it. And I did some of these at Stanford, repeated some of Piaget's experiments. And one is you have a tall, thin glass and a shorter, wider glass. And if you fill the shorter, wider glass with water and you pour it into the taller, thinner glass, of course, it's going to go up higher. And you ask the child which one has more water. Up to a certain age, every time they're going to say the taller one. And well, that's irrational. Where'd it come? It's magic. Well, they'll maybe come up with some magical explanation. Same thing. I would lay out 6 pennies in a one-to-one correspondence, 2 lines of them. And then I would take one line of pennies and spread them out so they're further apart, and ask the child which one has more pennies. Oh, they want the one where they're spread out more. And so what I'm saying here is the teenage version of this child would think, oh, no, there's no way I wouldn't have known that. Everybody knows that. But they've gone through these discontinuous sequences of development, and they don't realize that they've come to a very different place than they were when they started. Well, spiritual awakening is something like that. Gradually, it's possible to enter more and more fuller states of awareness than where we started from. Excuse me. And initially, those different states seem to be very different from our usual state of functioning. We describe them as, like Maslow describes them as peak experiences, transcendent experiences, and so on. But after a certain time, when that's become a more solidified way of being, and the Sufi term for this is maqam, M-A-Q-A-M, which means station. A hal, H-A-L, is a temporary experience, and maqam that's where you are. So when we reach the maqam that's at a higher level, it now seems to be the normal way of things to be. And we have a hard time even recalling of how we used to experience the world in a very different way. But if we're able to remember that, how things were in the past, then we would know that we're experiencing things in a much richer way, a much fuller way than we did at a previous state of being. Okay, so I think this would be a good time to pause and see if anybody has some questions or comments.
Hey, David, can't hear you.
I've unmuted everyone, I believe.
So I can't see everybody on my phone, so you can call on someone that has their hand up. Or
I'll ask one.
Okay.
Believe it or not. One of the things that you talked about it just recently, it almost sounded like you were talking about a non-fixed reality of existence, in that if we identify with something or we think it's a one-off type of an experience, I think science, hard science, not weird science, is beginning to discover that even the human body is a process. It's a non-static living process, that if you go into using electron microscopes, everything's alive and moving the whole time. So we're beginning to learn that about the human body and plants and everything else, that you can get smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's alive and it's vibrant. And so I'm wondering, has there been, or maybe you're familiar with, the similar concept to spirituality or knowing the divine, where it is a continual, active, vibrant process, and not necessarily a fixed way of knowing or state, if you will?
What a great question. Yes. So I'll take it from both physics and mysticism. From physics, there's a smallest discrete unit of time called the Planck time, and at a shorter period of time than that, you can't talk about anything meaningful. And there was a wonderful article in Scientific American some time ago where the writer said that really the way we perceive time is an illusion caused by our assumptions that we're existing in just 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. And if you get to the quantum level, things are not moving along the way nice and smooth like we think. The probability waves for things that only actualize into particles when there's a measurement or an active observation. Okay, so and as I mentioned last time, time doesn't just flow in the direction that we think it flows in from past to present and future. There is an effect called retrocausality, where something happening now from our vantage point is having an impact on something that happened at a previous time from our vantage point. And it's not actually traveling backwards in time, and physicists are trying to figure out what is this all about. So there's no preferred frame of reference for time. From the mystical side of things, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the mystics said that there's a new creation born again at every instant. So at every instant, everything goes back to the one, the divine, and at the next instant, there's a new creation born from that. So why don't we experience that? Well, just like when we go to see a movie in the theater, perhaps it's 60 frames a second, and if we could perceive that quickly, we would see a discrete set of pictures. Here's one, here's the next one, here's the next one. But our brain can't process that quickly, so it seems nice and smooth. But existence is kind of like that. It's going into existence, out of existence, into existence, out of existence. And the mystics say that that we have the capacity to bring about a transformation in each new instant of creation. So what is that all about? Well, if we assume that we're beings that are just kind of fixed in usual space and time, that even though there's the possibility of something fresh occurring at every instant, we keep projecting kind of like a simulation of a logical extrapolation of the way that things have been and our assumptions about how things are going to be, so we don't notice any difference. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this online experiment where the instructions are, you're going to see a team with white shirts and a team with black shirts, and the team with white shirts is going to be bouncing the basketball to each other, and just watch it for a minute and count how many bounces that you see. And if any of you have ever done this, I must say it fooled me too. And then so I counted them and they said, oh yeah, that's right, it was so many bounces. And now watch it again and don't worry about the bounces. And you look in the background, the whole time there's been a man dressed in a giant gorilla suit going back and forth pounding his chest. And I didn't see it because there wasn't any assumption there was going to be anything funny in this thing. I thought it was just about bouncing basketball. So literally I couldn't see something right in front of my eyes. Well, there's much that we don't perceive that's not just in front of our physical eyes, but in front of our subtle senses, which perhaps we haven't developed a capability of utilizing or operating. And so we assume that just everything is just like what appears to us through the physical senses. So one very important stage of awakening, regardless of what tradition a person pursues, is to do practices that help to awaken subtle senses, and these are described as like inner sight, inner hearing, inner sound, inner taste, inner touch, and so on. And there are very well-established practices that can help a person be able to develop these capacities. And then there's other practices to be able to modulate consciousness to different levels of reality, more subtle levels of light, and so on. So it's necessary to develop these tools of perception to be able to have an experience of awakening. You can't teach an infant Einstein's theory of relativity. It's hard enough to teach grown-ups about it, but I mean, if you have something that's just outside of the realm of experience and perception, it might as well not exist, which is why many people think, well, there can't be anything outside of what I know about and perceive through my physical senses. So did that answer your question?
I wanted to ask you a question, Don. You were talking for a while about stages of development, and that reminded me of some of Ken Wilber's work, and he also identifies lines of development, which I also think of in terms of personality types, and what seems to me to be the case that some people are going to just more naturally be inclined toward different pathways to spiritual experience. Can you comment on that at all?
Yes. In fact, I'll go back all the way back to the Bhagavad Gita, which is the scriptures of Hinduism. And if you've never read it, it's just an amazing work. And it talks about the different paths of yoga for different people. And many people, when they hear yoga, think about just the physical postures, but there's all different kinds of yoga. There's Raja Yoga, which is meditation. There's Bhakti Yoga, which is devotion. There's Karma Yoga, which is action. There's Jnana Yoga, which is wisdom. And different people are drawn to primarily to more one of those ways of going about their unfoldment than another. And if someone tries to pursue a way that's really not their natural way, they're probably not going to get very far with that. And so there's not just one body of spiritual practices that's like, well, everybody's got to learn this if they're going to get to the goodies. It's a person finding a way that enables them to feel more fully of who they really are. And Hazrat Inayat Khan, who's the one that brought Sufism to the West in the early 1900s, said, well, there's the path for some people of the mystic. There's the path of the religious person. There's the path of the businessman. There's the path of the scientist. There's the path of the musician. There's the path of the artist. And anyone who fully pursues whatever is their natural way of becoming the most of who they can be in life can achieve spiritual awakening through that modality. So it's a way I talked about in the first session that I think spiritual unfoldment is a way about enhancing our capacity about how we relate to whatever it is that we're relating to, because we live in an interconnected reality. So did that address your question?
Yeah, and I guess just a related reflection. You're talking earlier about how we can each manifest, our unique ability to observe and react and participate in the world. And that word "unique" puzzles me some. There have been maybe 110 billion Homo sapiens on Earth the time that our species has been around, and I don't myself feel that I'm necessarily unique. And I do agree that there are types and personalities, so I very much want to understand what my inclinations are. But that doesn't bring me to feel that there might not be other people with virtually identical inclinations. This idea of uniqueness is not something that draws me as I try to be in this space. And how would you respond on that?
Okay, well, I appreciate the question. And well, unique doesn't mean, and I know this is what you're implying, better than other people, or you're just so totally different from somebody else, they just think, well, this person is just really strange or avant-garde or eccentric or anything like that. But it's your particular combination of the way that you processed all the experiences in your life, the way that you, when you're being the most fully yourself, are relating, let's say, to other people. So think about a time when you had a really deep conversation with a friend and just kind of lost track of time for a while, and each of you found yourself coming up with ideas that you had never thought about before, that you probably wouldn't have thought about except for the interaction of what has taken place between the two of you. So has that ever happened?
You know, I believe it has. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what was transpiring in that particular situation with the two of you was unique in all of the universe. It wouldn't be that happening with you and other people or other two people, even though you might have been talking about a similar topic. You have, well, I'll go back to quantum physics. If two things have the same identical quantum state, they can't both be there because they'd be the same thing. So everything has got a unique quantum state. So there's never been or never could be someone that's got the combination of your physical ancestry, your genes, your experiences in life, but also your connection with the deeper levels of reality is different than that of anyone else. And that's why Ibn Arabi, I mentioned, I think last time, hundreds of years ago, said that every being has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no one ever can or will have access to. And that's a hard one for us to believe because, you know, we're pretty conditioned by everything and we think, well, what could I do that's really going to make a particular difference? But if you believe that this amazing being knew what he was talking about, perhaps you haven't discovered what that is or how to more fully bring it through. But just the fact that you trust that it's there, and that if you continue to, and I'm talking to anybody here, continue to work on yourself and find ways to bring about what Tiller talks about, this connection between more subtle levels of reality of your own being and the manifest levels of reality. Now, some doors are going to open that wouldn't have been there before, and there'll be things possible that you couldn't even imagine having been possible. So I'm not sure if that helps with your question.
No, thank you. So I'll let others jump in.
Not ready to jump.
Speaking of being able to do things that are not possible that may become possible as things start to dissolve, can you talk anything about bilocating?
Well, I mean, there's stories of these amazing beings that could manifest themselves in different places. Personally, I couldn't tell you how that came about or that even that would be a desirable thing to try to do. It's pretty general advice for people on the spiritual path to not pursue it. And I'm not saying that the being that perhaps was able to do that, that's the reason they pursue their spiritual path. But for us who are trying to engage in the process of our own awakening, if our motivation is to develop psychic powers or psychic phenomena, then we're only going to go so far, and chances are we're going to end up reinforcing the very ego that we're trying to transform to get to a more full state of being. And those some people are more naturally have capacities the way their nervous system is wired. Some people can see auras and other people can't. That doesn't mean that that person's more evolved than the one that can't, and so on. But it's kind of like there's a beautiful phrase of Hazrat Inayat Khan. He says, "Pick not flowers along the way; they will only detain you." Or I think of it like, well, don't get hung up on the cosmic midway, even though there's some really interesting shows going on, because there's always more. There's always a deeper and more fulfilling state that we can realize if we don't get off the transformational process at a certain level. So that's the best answer I can give to that. I'll tell a story though. There was in India, someone went to a guru and said, I've been meditating for all these years and watch what I can do. And so he walked across the water, the river. And the guru said, well, your years of sadhana, spiritual practice, are worth exactly 2 rupees because that's what it costs to pay the ferryman to drive you across the river.
I'll tell you.
But we look for phenomena, and that's why, I mean, people are drawn to people that perhaps have worked to develop some kind of psychic power, and many people think, well, they must be a realized being, and I want to hang around them because they must have some deep wisdom, and oftentimes they're very much embroiled in their own ego trips and are using that to manipulate other people. We have just about a little time left, so I'd like to hear from anybody else that might have questions or comments about what you've heard so far. Now that we're almost done the 3rd of these 4th meetings.
I'd like to hear a little bit more on the subject I think William brought up last week. Is how do you know you're having an authentic experience?
Oh, this is a good question. Well, if you're in the midst of it and you're stopping to ask if you're having an authentic experience, then chances are you've just pulled yourself right out of the experience, because now you're going to be thinking about something that doesn't compute in the ordinary realm of thought. After someone has let's say a transcendent experience, you are likely to experience kind of like the after ripples of it. I mean, it could be feelings of bliss and a recall of being in a state that you really can't put into words, but you know it was so different from your usual state of functioning, and it has a lingering after effect in your being. But sometimes what happens if a person's had a profound experience, then they're going to want to tell other people about it. And the first time they share it, it's very much alive. But about by the 5th time or the 10th time, it's like something in the back pages of the newspaper. It's really lost its life, and they're just reporting on something that is no longer connected to their actual level of functioning. So perhaps a better way of thinking about this is, how do you know you're on the right track in your spiritual journey? Well, chances are you're going to experience, let's say, positive side effects may include a deeper feeling of interconnectedness with everything around you, a feeling of more light coming from your own being and perceiving more light in your environment, a sense of expansiveness in your being, so you feel like your boundaries don't stop at your skin. But hopefully, as I mentioned last time in the second session, you still maintain a firm groundedness in your being, so you're very much connected with your life in the world and able to function much more fully, but you're not getting caught up in circumstances the way that you used to. And next time I'm going to talk about ways to use situations in our life as further openings to awakening rather than seeing them as obstacles or hindrances.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts that you have, or anything that I haven't gotten to so far that that you hope perhaps I can cover some in the 4th session? And as I mentioned last time, I really welcome if anybody has questions or comments. If you go to uumystics.org and click on this presentation, there's kind of a blog thing where you can put in whatever comments or questions you want. And I do look at that pretty regularly, and I will try to address them either on that blog or when we have our 4th session next week. So I really would welcome very much your input.
I would just mention, Don, that I was just taking a little look at your book, GPS for the Soul, on the write-up out at Amazon, and you were talking about relational non-duality, and wanting to see if you might be willing to touch on that on the next round.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I will do that. A term I call relational unity, which is not the same as duality, and it's not the same as a loss of identity merging into the one. It's a way of being in the midst of existence, but being much more connected to what we're relating to. So yes, I will talk about that next time. Any last question? Yes.
My question is regarding the transcendent state. Do Sufis believe that since this is an ongoing, infinite process of indeterminate time, do you ever reach a deathless state where you're united with the divine and all this labor can rest for a while?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I'll just comment briefly on it. Well, a couple comments. One, a Sufi asked, or someone who was studying with a Sufi teacher said, teacher, tell me what happens after you die. And he said, you'll have to ask someone who's going to die. I plan to live. But the other answer to that is that there is a state in yoga called nirvikalpa samadhi, which means beyond seed. It means there's nothing left of any, and it's normally thought of as just being totally dissolved into the infinite ocean of bliss forevermore. And it is possible, apparently, for some beings to reach that state and hang out there, I would say, for an indeterminate period of time. But this is my own belief here. I don't believe that they have really lost the essence of who they are. I think it's just incredibly latent and dormant. And I think there is a possibility that they could reemerge into existence again. And many Sufis say that, and I'll explain this, that duality is a higher state than unity. And what they mean by that is the reason they say that, or separation, not duality. Separation is higher state than unity. In separation, there's the possibility of a relationship with the beloved, but in unity, there's not. And they would prefer to have this relationship of love, lover, and beloved. So it depends on what somebody is looking for. But I think, to me, what gives things the most meaning is that there's a never-ending evolution that we can each participate in. And if someone gave me a ticket to go into nirvikalpa samadhi forever, I'd say no, thank you.
Okay.
And I think our time has gone by, so thank you all very much for joining in on this one, and hopefully all of you can come back next Tuesday for our last one.
Okay, thank you very much, Don.
Okay.
Namaste.
Bye-bye. Namaste.
Thank you.